Okay, I think we'll get going. Thank you all for joining this evening. You will have seen from the email that we are looking at Caravaggio tonight. Caravaggio had a brief stint in Sicily. So he was there, he was on the ground, much like Van Dyck, who we were looking at last week. And we will talk about the painting, The Burial of St. Lucy, in the context of Caravaggio's, of his life and his work as well. Like last time, I'm going to just start by sharing an image of the painting in situ. Again, another holiday snap, just because it gives you a sense of the scale of the picture. So this is the painting we're looking at. Hopefully not too underwhelming. I think you've probably all seen this in the email. Hopefully not too underwhelming in the sense that it is a fantastic painting. It's 4 meters high by 3 meters wide. So hopefully this gives you a little sense of the scale. But it is unfortunately incredibly damaged. And so you have to view it from quite a distance. And even then, it's quite hard to make out the intricacies of the picture. That said, I have managed to find quite a good image of the painting online. Slightly saturated, but the one that we're going to be working from tonight. But you'll see that it's not quite as juicy as some of those Caravaggio paintings when we get up close, just because it has been damaged over time, combination of conditions and botched restoration jobs, which I think have been going on since the 19th century. But rather spectacularly, the reason I want to also show you this picture is because the painting is in situ. It's in the place for which it was painted. It certainly would not have been in this extraordinary installation of sort of placing the stretcher on this sort of metal slot or metal type support without any kind of surround. It feels slightly strange, but it sort of adds to the slightly contemporary and modern feel of the painting, which we're going to come on to a bit later. I also just thought it would be worth having a look at the picture in this sort of surrounding architecture, and just thinking about paintings that are painted for a certain location. And we can see here that the apse or the dome of the cupola in the church very much is sort of in dialogue with the painting. I don't know enough about the interiors of this church, but these feel far more recent than 17th century interiors. So I would imagine that it has been adapted in some way. But for this kind of arch, the architecture within the picture, which takes up a good half of the painting, it's very much, as I say, sort of talking to its surrounding architecture, and that's the beauty of seeing these works in the places for which they were intended. So I'm going to switch to the image now, just so that we all have a better view of the picture. And as always, I think what we'll do is we will just have a look at the painting in its most basic sort of structure, and look at how he's kind of composed the picture just with forms and color. So we can see that we've got a group of people in the lower half of the canvas, as I said, 4 meters high, so they're probably taking up a couple of meters. So probably not dissimilar to life size. And you have this sort of architectural background providing quite a sort of stark and bleak backdrop. We've got one figure lying prostrate on the ground, with her arms sort of outstretched towards us, and then two figures sort of framing that central figure that's lying on the ground. So not only sort of giving a frame either side of this central figure that our attention is very much focused on, but also giving this variation in height and in depth. So you can see particularly the figure on the right with his rather conspicuous buttocks facing us. He's much bigger than the figure on the ground, which may be intentional, as we may discover shortly. And then you have this kind of group of figures, all looking rather woebegone, rather sad in the background, and then these sort of slightly two larger figures on the right. But you'll see from this reproduction that this painting, unfortunately, has suffered over the years, and that is why it really isn't at the forefront of people's knowledge about Caravaggio's oeuvre, but it is a particularly important painting, and one of the later paintings that he paints. So it's really sort of at the end of his career. But I promise you, as we get closer to the picture and when it sorts itself out, we will get a nicer view of the individual figures. But I'm just going to leave it on the screen there for now, while we just think about Caravaggio as a figure. I give you a bit of a background about who he is, where he came from, and where this sits in his journey. And that is a geographical journey. He was born up in, as we've learned with Antonello da Messina, he was born in Caravaggio. So he is named after the place where he was born, which is a small town on the just outside of Cremona, so not too far southeast of Milan, in northern Italy. And he was born there in 1571. And shortly after he was born, that whole region of Italy was struck with a terrible bubonic plague, and it wiped out sort of the whole male side of his family. Really, his father he lost at the age of 5 or 6. His grandfather, his uncle, and his maternal uncle as well, I think. So he had quite a sort of traumatic childhood. And it seemed that the family kind of were moving between Milan and Cremona. And we know that Caravaggio, at 12 years old, signed a contract to train with an artist called Simone Petezzano. And he was an artist who was from Milan, from the region, but he was very heavily inspired by Venetian painters. There may have been a Venetian trip at this point, and a rather wonderful comparison with this painting and some of Caravaggio's later painting in particular, which I wasn't aware of, is the martyrdom of St. Andrew by Titian, which he had seen which he may have seen if he visited Venice. And if you look it up, I'm sorry, not the martyrdom of St. Andrew, martyrdom of St. Lawrence. If you look it up, you'll see that you can see Titian's actually quite direct impact on the work of Caravaggio, I think. And if he hadn't seen it, it's quite surprising, because Titian's work sort of takes on this very somber, kind of dark tone. So it may have been he went to Venice, he may have seen the painting, he may not have, he may have known it from prints, he may not have known it at all, it may just be mere coincidence. But we know that in 1592, he leaves northern Italy. We don't know why, it's unclear, but it may have been that he was involved even at this young age in a murder in some capacity, but we're not quite sure of the details. And I guess that introduces something that most of you probably know about Caravaggio, and that is that he had a very turbulent life, and was always getting into trouble with the law, and ultimately the sort of latter years of his life, including the part where he paints this painting, are very much on the run. He's a fugitive, basically just trying to escape the law from one place to the next. He goes down to Rome in 1592. This is where he sort of starts his career as an independent artist. And he works as an assistant to various sort of minor painters in Rome, sort of helping with still lifes and sort of decorative motifs in their painting. And then he joined significantly the workshop of a very famous artist in Rome at the time in the 1590s, an artist called Cavaliere d'Arpino, who was a big artist based in Rome, completing major commissions. But Caravaggio had quite a sort of minor role in his studio. And it was only really when he was taken on by a very important patron, Francesco Maria del Monte, who was a cardinal based in a very beautiful palace, 16th century palace in the center of the city, that he really started sort of making great contacts and gaining great commissions, both in the city and beyond. For example, for the Grand Duke of Tuscany, he started creating works for him via this cardinal, and started painting some of his, and this is where he sort of embarks on painting these major altarpieces. But one thing I should say stylistically is Caravaggio is really, I guess, so famous because he is a pioneering artist in this very realistic style of painting, very sharp light, which I'm sure many of you know is chiaroscuro, so there's strong difference between light and dark, light and shade. And we know from documentary evidence that he used a lamp in his studio and sat at a very at great height to create these very dramatic effects, and that he was also using models in order to paint. So he was painting directly onto the canvas with very little underdrawing, probably just a sketch in brushed out sketch, and not even sort of creating preparatory sketches or drawings, which of course was the kind of classical training. That was the way in which artists were taught to create work, but painting directly from live models. And that was something that he and his contemporaries in Rome really embraced and started to do. And of course, for a fledgling artist like Caravaggio, you don't have the money to hire models. Women didn't tend to model, so he was acquiring people from the streets and prostitutes as well to sit for him as sort of female figures in his paintings, which of course were often religious. And one example being the Death of the Virgin, which is now in the Louvre. It was in the collection of King Charles I of England, and it had been created. It was a commission for the Santa Maria della Scala, which is quite a major church in Rome, near the San Giovanni. And it was basically revealed. It was unveiled, I should say, and it was immediately rejected, and another painting was put there in its place because he had used a woman of the street to depict the Virgin Mary. So he was a very controversial figure, and this continued throughout his life. He got into all sorts of trouble. One of my favorite stories of his time in Rome was chucking a whole load of artichokes over a waiter because they were covered in butter, not oil, and assaulting the waiter for this. All of this is documented. And he was trained in swordsmanship when he was up in Milan when he was younger. He wasn't the most diligent of students, and had been arrested for carrying a sword when he was under the aegis of Cardinal del Monte. So he was always sort of in and out of trouble, but all the while creating a real name for himself. Both, I suppose, artistically very positive, but also not so good. But he became a major figure. A number of artists were sort of followers of Caravaggio, very much were influenced by his style. But it was the murder of a man called Ranuccio Tomassoni, which meant that he departed from the city. He had a duel This man Tomasoni may have been was probably linked to a model that he would use for some of his paintings. Again, a lady of the street, and they had a sort of arranged duel, probably over some disagreement with this lady who Tomasoni was effectively sort of the pimp of, we think. And Caravaggio had been using her as a model very, very prolifically, and perhaps had a relationship with her as well. A duel had been arranged, and that in itself was actually a criminal offense, to duel, I suppose, just in public or in private. But he then ends up murdering Tomasoni, and so he then escapes Rome, as sort of with a capital sentence, and he was sort of on the run, and in the knowledge that anyone in Italy, or part of the Papal States, would be able to kill him if they got their hands on him. And there was also a clause that said that they could also just return not just the body but just the head. So you often then start to then see Caravaggio rather also begging for pardon, perhaps, but quite ironically and cheekily painting these a number of paintings of beheading of St. John the Baptist, and often using his own self-portrait as these kind of beheaded heads, and in one case actually sending it to Scipione Borghese, who was a kind of influential cardinal at the papal court. So certainly cheeky, on the run. He goes down to Naples. He goes to the hills outside of Rome, or between Rome and Naples, and then to Naples, and he is protected there by the Colonna family, one of the most sort of powerful families in Italy, who he had known through connections with his parents when he was sort of growing up near Milan. Constanza Colonna was married to the Sforza Duke, who was the Duke of Milan, and so Caravaggio had connections with that family, both through his aunt, I think, who was a wet nurse to the children of that family, and also through his father, who was a stonemason at the court of the Sforza court. So the Colonna very much became very important later in his life. They sort of protected him in Naples, and he stayed in Naples for a while, and then he goes down to Malta, again, sort of trying to sort of keep away from anyone that's going to get hold of him, and he tries to, probably on the advice of the Colonna family, he tries to gain sort of pardon by admitting himself, or applying to the Knights of the Order of St. John, who were kind of chivalric order based on Malta, and they were a kind of a collection of Christian soldiers. And so if he had gained sort of mission into that group, then he would become he would be sin-free effectively, and he does eventually become a Knight of the Order of St. John. He completes a number of commissions there, and one of the men that he works for helps him to sort of gain membership, and then he gets into trouble with a more senior member of the Knights, so he's on the run again, and that's where this painting comes in. So he heads from Malta up to we think to the southern coast of Sicily, probably entering, for anyone who's been to the lovely Baroque towns in the southeast, probably entering near Scicli, or another town sort of near to there. He heads up through overland, and he arrives in Syracuse, where a friend of his called Mario Miniti, who he had worked with in Rome. He had been a model for a number of his paintings in Rome, had a thriving workshop. And so Caravaggio sort of sought refuge with this friend, who really propped him up and recommended him to the local Senate. And it was the Senate that effectively commissioned Caravaggio to paint this picture. And it was at a time that in Syracuse, they were really trying to kind of push renovation of churches, and I suppose promote the lives of local saints in the city, and so he just got very lucky in that he arrived and he had been recommended and was commissioned to paint a painting of the burial of Saint Lucy, who was the patron saint of Syracuse and still is today. She was, so I should say it was for a church called the Church of St. Lucy, the Basilica of St. Lucy, which had been built. It was a medieval church that had been built on the site where St. Lucy had been buried, on the site of the Christian catacombs in which she had been buried. And the commission was for the altarpiece of that church. There had been a number of sort of rival cults that had kind of grown in other parts of Italy, notably in Venice, because her remains, her relics, had been stolen from Syracuse in the Middle Ages. And so this was kind of pushed to reconnect Syracuse with St. Lucy and this altarpiece in particular, to kind of reinstate the, I suppose, their legitimacy, that as the kind of patron, as Lucy, as having Lucy as their patron saint. So the remains had been taken from this exact spot, which in where they had been kept until the Middle Ages, and then they sort of, well, people had been claiming that they had them, but no one really knows where they went. So this was to kind of enhance that relationship with the saint, and was in this very important sanctuary and church, which was outside of the city walls. So for those of you who've been to Syracuse, surprisingly to me, this church is actually not in the old town, which is called Ortigia, but it's actually in the kind of low-rise modern area of the city, and it sort of stands alone, really, and so it's sort of slightly off the beaten track, but certainly worth a visit. So St. Lucy she was from Syracuse. She was native to the city, and she was a 4th century saint who had been a kind of wealthy, noble young virgin, and she had given up, she had made a vow of chastity and given up all of her worldly goods in order to live like Christ in poverty. And she had been married to a non-believer, and he had sort of got quite suspicious and thought that she was having an affair, basically, seeing someone else, spending money somewhere else, and spending her time somewhere else. But in fact, what was actually the case is that she had become a bride of Christ, and he sort of told the Roman authorities, and she was brutally murdered on the site of her burial, so on this site where the church stands. So it's quite a kind of poignant spot on which to witness the painting, quite moving, especially when you look at the brutality of this painting. But she was said to be dragged by the Roman soldiers of Diocletian to a brothel, and had been instructed effectively to be raped by whoever had wanted to, and she had not moved, so she had by some unknown force remained on the spot, and so they covered her in boiling paraffin and resin, set light to her, but she stayed alive. So the final thing was that they thrust a sword into her throat, and she still didn't die until she was offered Holy Communion, at which point she entered into the realm of Christ. So just on that note, on the martyrdom, I suppose let's go straight to Lucy herself and have a look at this very very kind of I don't know, it's not gory, but Caravaggio, for those of you who know the painting in Dublin of Doubting Thomas, he has this amazing way of creating these very plastic figures, especially when they're wounded. And we can really see this very deep gash in the neck, in her neck, where the sword has been plunged. And St. Lucy is very much dead here. Her mouth is sort of lolling. There's no strength in her jaw, and of course her eyes are closed. And one thing to notice, and of course her skin is incredibly pale, almost sort of greening. Don't want to make too many claims about pigment tone and color based on this reproduction, which is quite saturated, but also on the state of the painting. As you can see, as we go around, we will just discover bits that simply are not there. And unfortunately quite a lot repainted, but probably in a kind of non-intrusive way. So I think we can trust what we see to a degree, at least. But what I want to point out when we're looking at the figure of Lucy is this kind of the way in which she pushes her hand out. I've read somewhere that in a sense of kind of a kind of charitable stretch, which is I guess you know, in a sense sort of asking for charity, but at the same time very much for me is much more reminiscent of the cross, of the crucifix. And this, interestingly, this pose is not dissimilar to the pose of the Virgin. So this affinity with not only Christian imagery, but both in the case of Jesus in relation to the crucifixion, but also in relation to Marian imagery in the figure of the dead Virgin in that painting that's now at the Louvre, which is also unfortunately quite damaged. But you see this similar foreshortened arm. We know foreshortening when you feel as though the arm is sort of protruding out of the canvas towards you, and just the general position, and the sort of her head thrown back like that. What's interesting is, of course, light is synonymous, or at least heavily associated with both the presence and absence of it with Caravaggio. And Lucy, which many of you may know, is sort of representative of light. She lux, from which the name comes in Latin, literally means light. And I think it was St. Ambrose, I wrote down a quote, which I'm sure you will all understand why I very much appreciate. St. Ambrose wrote, in Lucy is said, the way of light. I was rather happy to read that. But you can see here that, of course, she is heavily lit. But one thing to note is this amazing, very, very brightly lit hand. And again, try to see through the damage. But this hand of this bishop, who again is sort of non-existent, who is blessing the saint, is very, very starkly lit. You can see the light in the painting is coming from upper right. I seem to remember there's some windows in the church, not necessarily in the recess where the painting was, but the light coming from sort of upper right, which would suggest that that was where the light would enter the church. And we can see it very strongly hitting the hand of the bishop, who is blessing the saint. And the relationship between the gravedigger, this thug of a man who we'll have a closer look at in a minute, looking up at this moment and suddenly seeing the light, as it were. And it was said that Lucy had hoped that people would kind of be converted or see the light on her upon her death. And so we have this kind of actual sort of Caravaggio is actually spelling that out, that we see the gravedigger literally having a moment of epiphany, looking at the bishop's hand, which of course is illuminated by the light, and he himself is quite brightly lit too. But there's this kind of quite tragic juxtaposition between these absolute brutes, both of the grave diggers, also of this soldier in armor, who again is barely there anymore. The size of them, the scale of them, these powerful men with sort of kind of thick bull necks and very short hair, who are digging the grave, but who stand sort of over this very beautiful, delicate woman, of course smaller because she's set further back, but it just gives that extra sense of pathos to the painting, which is incredibly moving, not least because of this group of figures at the back. But before we move there, let's just have a closer look. I mean, these amazing arms, this, even in the state of condition, this terrible state of condition, you see bulging veins in this powerful arm here. It just gives you a sense of quite how incredible it would have looked when it was freshly painted. You can see the light hitting the nose of the gravedigger here, and then of course Caravaggio's sort of signature sharp light, highlighting the musculature of his other arm, again the veins in his hand, and sort of everything kind of tense as he's digging into the ground, but at the same time sort of distracted, looking up at the bishop, while the other one is very much intent on his task, and he's sort of shrouded in this rather lovely white drapery that we can see the highlights of here. And again, these buttocks, which aren't dissimilar to the work of Jacopo Bassano, who's a Venetian painter in the 16th century. Always, if you see a painting with a pair of buttocks like that in the corner, you can almost always attribute it to Jacopo Bassano. So in this case, no, but just a little bit of advice for when you're next going around a Venetian museum. And I would rather not go any further down because it's all just sort of hideous and not really there. So let's go up instead and have a look at these two figures to start with. So this is seemingly a kind of religious figure, looking down, of course, grief-stricken at the saint. And then he's standing next to this veiled lady. And these two figures have been, again, with this Christian imagery, they've been likened to the figures of, well, particularly this figure, the figure of Mary and the apostles at the foot of the cross, often seen in this kind of, in this sort of state of mourning. I'm not sure of the exact reference, but I had read that somewhere, that these had a kind of specifically religious undertone to them, specifically Christian undertone to them, and that would of course tie in with what we've just said in relation to St. Lucy and her relationship to images of Christ. And then you have these three heads here. Sort of ignore this one because I think that's very, very heavily repainted, but this sort of figure, less successful figure, I think, sort of in a moment of shock. So and here of course this man, much more successful, I think, wiping away his tears with a cloth or with a handkerchief, and sort of looking down again. For those of you that joined the session on Domenico Veneziano on grief, you know, this idea of the kind of range of emotions that one feels at a moment like this, all kind of encapsulated here in different, or personified, I guess, in different figures. And then here, another figure looking away, looking towards the light with this furrowed brow, has been suggested this might be a self-portrait, which was not uncommon for Caravaggio to include self-portraits in his work. And then over here, we've got a bishop. I don't actually know who this is or whether or not it has been identified. I haven't seen anywhere that he's got a name, but he may well do. Please shout if you know anything different. And you can see him blessing, but you have here then the sort of soldier standing back and watching this all unfurl. And this is the figure that we see in the painting of the Martyrdom of St. Andrew by Caravaggio. So that's where hence the Titian confusion came. And that's in Naples. It's actually not in Naples. It was painted in Naples. It's now at Cleveland Museum of Art in the States. But this figure is lifted from that composition. And we have this wonderful juxtaposition between these two figures, sort of good and bad, pure and evil, light and dark, Christian and pagan. So there's this whole sort of this bigger religious undertone to this painting, and here we see it in these sort of lovely this contrast, both symbolic and visual. And then down here, probably from what it looks like, the best preserved of the figures is this, or still sort of semi see-through, but this sort of lady with her head in her hands, this older lady with her head in her hands, again another expression of grief, looking down at the dead figure of Lucy. And this, talking of lifting figures, I don't know if that's actually just the image or the reconstruction, but we can see sort of almost her cheek being pushed up there. Of course, this amazing way that he catches the light on the furrowed brow, strands of hair, and on her white headscarf. But this figure, this grief-stricken figure with her head in her hands, is of course lifted from a painting, from the painting of the Death of the Virgin, that the one that I've referred to, that's in the Louvre. Sorry, no, not that painting. It's lifted from the beheading of St. John the Baptist, which is in Malta, which he paints just before coming to Sicily. It was his last commission in Malta. So he's again different island, just reinterpreting that figure in a different scene. Again, probably taken from a live model. Perhaps he even used a different model in order to paint this iteration of it. But if we do step back and look at the composition now as a whole, just wait for the image to adjust, we can see that as I said at the beginning, the composition is very much split in two halves, and you have this very, very stark, somber upper half, which feels, and again, condition related, but feels this stony wall, feels Rothko-like. It feels mesmeric, absorbing, meditative in a way. And then you have this sort of action, this kind of half of the canvas that's compact. It's full of figures. There is different heights, as we said, different depths, and it's very tightly cropped, which is a very typical feature of Caravaggio's painting. It was very innovative at the time, that he would crop his pictures as if they were photographs, and this is why he's inspired generations of painters and filmmakers as well, because he has these kind of cinematic views of the subject at hand. And the interesting thing is that wall at the back. I have read that it's been compared to the catacombs, the Christian catacombs that Caravaggio is said to have visited which is where St. Lucy was buried, beneath this church. However, I actually want to propose another idea. I think that's probably very valid. I think the church architecture probably also has something to do with it. And the fact that there's this height as well, given that this is an altarpiece, it's a very clever device to leave this vacant space at the top of the painting. But it also creates an energy, sort of both kind of upward, but also sort of heaviness, I suppose, onto the figures and the situation. But I also want to propose, having just been to Syracuse, we know that Caravaggio visited what is called the ear of Dionysus, which actually was a term that he coined, and it's basically it's a cave that you can still walk into today, which I did, which is why this has come into my mind. And it's a cave that had a sort of I think a man-made slit kind of cut into the top to allow for acoustics, and it was created supposedly by the tyrant emperor Dionysius in the 4th century. And Caravaggio visits there with a man called Vincenzo Mirabella, or Mirabello, I can't remember. And he wrote a book I think was published in 1613, so very contemporary, about the kind of archaeological sites in Syracuse. And Caravaggio visits the catacombs with him, but he also visits this cave, which Caravaggio gives the name the Ear of Dionysius, because not only was this cave intended to have this slit cut in the ceiling so the acoustics could be heard for the prisoners that were being kept in this cave by this tyrant emperor. That was sort of the idea of the cave. It was somewhere to keep prisoners, but he had the acoustics made so that the jailer who was sitting above could hear all of their plotting and their admission to guilt, etc., etc. But Caravaggio visits this cave, and he comments that it's actually shaped like an ear. So not only is it an ear so that the emperor could hear what was going on, but it was also an ear because it was actually shaped like one. It's sort of curved, and it has this sort of slit which kind of tapers at the top. And so I don't know when he visited. He may have visited it after he painted this picture, but I thought that was quite interesting, because when you're in there, you feel absolutely tiny. And I took some brilliant pictures of single figures with all this space above them. So it just reminded me of that. Anyway, to wrap up, so we've had a look pretty intensely at the picture, and so he paints this. He then, before it gets unveiled on December the 13th, which is the feast day of St. Lucy, we know that he starts it at the beginning of November. So it's really not very long that he paints this. He paints it in probably just over a month. We know that he leaves before the feast day, so before it's unveiling, and he goes up to Messina, which was a huge city, really bustly, obviously a port, trade spot, being right by the straits, up to, opposite Calabria, as it is today, but it was a much bigger city, almost rivaling Rome. And he paints 2 more paintings there. One was an adoration of the shepherds, and the other one that he paints there is, I'll have to come back to on that. I've just had a mind blank. He paints the adoration of the shepherds, and he paints the raising of Lazarus. And then after that, he heads back to Naples, and sort of still on the run, really, from Malta. And I mean, he's sort of between a rock and a hard place at this point. And then from there, he thinks that he's had a pardon from Rome. So on his journey back to Rome, he takes he takes a boat up to Porto Ercole, which is up in Tuscany. He gets detained on the way. He sends his paintings on, and then he kind of, I think, rides overground to meet the boat in Porto Ercole. And it's there that we don't quite know how, perhaps malaria, perhaps something slightly more suspicious, but it's there that he dies at the age of 38.